Joining me now is our French politics editor, Marc Perelman, who's covering all of this for us. And Marc, first of all, what can you tell us about the protest today?
Well, clearly it's important both for the unions and the government, because this is the first face-off since the presidential and legislative elections a few months ago. The unions had warned that they would take to the streets because this is what traditionally happens in France, especially in times of economic crisis. Growth is still there in France, but obviously recession is looming. There is a lot of concern about purchasing power, about the rising cost of energy, the rising cost of fuel, and so on. And so the unions are demanding that the wages should also get a raise. The government is saying we need to be careful. There is already inflation. What we've done is to limit the rise in electricity prices, the rise in fuel. So that's what we're doing to protect. But clearly, the unions are going to see exactly if there are lots of people on the streets, if there are strikes in the coming days, to know how far they can go, not only on this issue of purchasing power, but also on some reforms that the government wants to see implemented, first and foremost, the pension system reform.
Yeah, that's a really big issue, isn't it? It was a big issue in protests a year or so as well. Tell us a bit about that and what progress has or hasn't been made on pension reform.
Well, clearly, this is an extremely controversial issue. Emmanuel Macron promised when he was first elected in 2017 that he would reform the system. He tried and tried. There were massive protests on the streets. He was hoping to push this through Parliament, and then COVID happened, and this was never implemented. Now he's been re-elected, not so well because in Parliament he only has a relative majority, but he said and repeated in recent weeks that he wants to push through a reform whereby people would work longer because he said this is a demographic trend. There's no other way to maintain our system here in France. And right now there are hesitations about how and when this would happen. There was a dinner yesterday at the Élysée Palace where this was discussed. Basically, the president has said there'll be a few months of discussions with the unions, with the business leaders, and so on. But this winter, we need to put something on the parliament's table to push through a reform. This is going to be extremely controversial and is dangerous politically for Emmanuel Macron. But he said, I was re-elected to reform. I'll do what's needed to make this happen.
So maybe more strikes in the weeks ahead.
That's a good way of thinking.
All right. Thanks very much, Marc Perelman, our French politics editor.